The 6th century before Christ was an age of crumbling gods and rising empires. Across the scorched deserts and jagged mountains of ancient Persia, tribes fought for survival, until one man rose above them all. His name was Cyrus the Great, a ruler with a vision so vast it threatened to swallow the known world. He dreamed of an empire bound not by fear but by order, a perfect machine of loyalty, discipline and faith. But to forge such an empire, Cyrus needed more than ordinary soldiers. He needed men who would not die in spirit, even if their bodies fell. He needed immortals. From the scattered clans of Persia, Cyrus began his experiment, a creation not of myth but of design. 10,000 chosen men, handpicked for their strength, precision and obedience. They were trained not only to fight, but to endure, to survive the unbearable heat of the desert, to march through storms without breaking formation, to kill without hesitation or rage. Their armor shimmered like fish scales under the sun, plates of bronze and iron sewn onto silk. When they moved, they did so as one body. Their footsteps struck the ground in perfect rhythm, a sound that echoed like the beating of a single heart. Villages fell silent as the golden dust of their march darkened the horizon. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Even the wind seemed to pause. To their enemies, the immortals were not human. When one fell in battle, another immediately stepped forward to take his place. Their numbers were always 10,000, never more, never less. The Greeks would later whisper that they could not be killed, that they were born from the earth itself, that the gods had forged them from shadow and iron. But the truth was far more terrifying. The illusion of eternity was not magic, it was discipline. The Persians had discovered the secret to psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. Every enemy who faced them believed he was fighting an endless army, a tide that could not be stopped. The sight of their glittering shields, the sound of their synchronized march, the calm on their faces as death approached. It broke armies before swords ever clashed, and at their center, watching in silence, stood Cyrus the Great, the architect of immortality. He had given the world its first true professional army, a living symbol of divine authority. The immortals were no longer men. They were the empire's eternal breath, and through them Persia itself became deathless. By the middle of the 6th century before Christ, the old world was dying. Babylon, once the beating heart of Mesopotamia, had grown fat and slow. Egypt, mother of ancient wonders, had become a ghost of its own glory. Across the Near East, thrones crumbled and crowns lost their luster. The gods were silent. The air itself seemed to wait for something or someone to rise. That someone was Cyrus the Great. He saw opportunity where others saw ruin. From the dust of fading empires, he began to build a new one, not merely through conquest, but through order and persuasion. He offered defeated kings mercy instead of slaughter, but he demanded loyalty carved in stone. One by one, nations fell under his shadow. The banners of Persia spread like wildfire from the Aegean shores to the green valleys of the Indus. The world had never seen such vast dominion under a single man, but conquest was only the beginning. Rule, Cyrus understood, required something more terrifying than war is control. To hold so many lands together, he needed not only armies of numbers, but an army of meaning. Soldiers who embodied power itself. Soldiers who were seen even when unseen, whose mere presence whispered, "The king is everywhere." Thus the immortals became more than a weapon. They became the soul of the empire. Wherever they marched, they carried not just swords but the weight of divine law. They guarded palaces, crushed rebellions, and stood at the edge of every throne room, a wall of gold and silence. No rebellion dared breathe beneath their gaze. Their existence was both military and mystical, 1,000 symbols woven into a single fear, that Persia would never die. When one immortal fell, another rose in perfect rhythm, and so did Persia. The world began to believe that the empire itself could not end. "They do not die," said foreign spies. "They multiply." Even the Greeks, proud and skeptical, called them athanatoi, the deathless ones. At night, the sound of their synchronized march echoed through the marble corridors of Persepolis, the heartbeat of a civilization made flesh. Their discipline became the pulse of the empire, their silence its law. And high above them all stood Cyrus, no longer just a conqueror, but the architect of eternity. Through the immortals, he created not an army, but a living idea. That power, once perfected, could outlast death itself. Persia had found its guardians, and the world had found its fear. Cyrus the Great knew that empire could not survive on conquest alone. Cities could be burned, kings could be killed, but without discipline, victory would rot into chaos. He understood a truth far older than war itself, that an empire endures not through fear but through order. So he forged an order in human form, an army unlike any the world had ever seen. 10,000 men. 10,000 reflections of his will. From across Persia, the strongest and most loyal were chosen. Boys barely grown into men were taken from noble houses and hardened in the fires of discipline. For years they trained in the desert heat and freezing nights. They learned to run for miles across the dunes without breaking formation. They drew bows until their fingers bled. They thrust spears into straw men until muscle replaced hesitation. They were not raised to kill, they were raised to never break. Each immortal was expected to master 3 arts: endurance, archery, and close combat. But their true power lay not in their weapons but in their mind. They were drilled until their bodies obeyed command faster than thought. When one soldier fell, another stepped seamlessly into his place, restoring the line before the enemy could even blink. 10,000 men became one organism, breathing, fighting, and killing as a single being. To the Persians, they were proof of divine order. To their enemies, they were an impossible nightmare. Greek historian Herodotus would later write that their number never changed: 10,000, always whole. If one was killed, another immediately replaced him. The illusion of immortality became their most terrifying weapon. Armies facing them saw not men, but a machine, a wall of bronze and gold that did not die, did not retreat, did not hesitate. At dawn, when the sun rose over the Persian plains, their armor blazed like fire. From afar it looked as if the dawn itself marched with Cyrus. Witnesses said the reflection of their shields could blind a man at 100 paces. The air shimmered with heat, dust, and divine radiance. The line between soldiers and gods blurred. Their creed was simple: order is eternity. Through them, Cyrus built not only an army but an idea, a living illusion of perfection. Every immortal carried the belief that Persia's strength was infinite, that no wound could end it, no death could diminish it. It was a form of psychological warfare so effective that even centuries later, their legend would haunt the minds of conquerors. The Immortals were more than warriors. They were symbols of discipline, faith, and the terrible beauty of power. And as the empire's banners burned against the desert sky, it was clear that Cyrus had done the impossible. He had taught men to imitate eternity. To be chosen among the Immortals was to be born into privilege, and to surrender your life to something far greater than yourself. Only the sons of the noblest families of Persia, Media, and Elam could hope for such a fate. From the moment they could walk, their world was shaped by command and expectation. Their childhoods were forged in pain and precision. At dawn, they rode horses across the burning plains until their thighs bled from the saddle. They drew bows until their fingertips split open, then kept shooting until blood and sweat became one. They learned to run under the weight of armor, to fight with spears in the searing heat, and to stand motionless for hours while the desert winds screamed around them. To lie was considered worse than death. To flinch was shame. Truth was sacred, not merely a virtue, but the foundation of their faith. For the Immortals followed the old Zoroastrian creed: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Honor was their religion, obedience their form of worship. Every sin began with a lie, and every punishment began with disobedience. Those who endured long enough to earn the title Athanatoi, the deathless, were rewarded with a life of extraordinary privilege. Draped in silks dyed crimson and cobalt, their armor shimmered with bronze and gemstones. They wore gold necklaces engraved with the king's sigil, and belts studded with rubies that caught the firelight like drops of blood. When they marched through the streets of Persepolis, citizens knelt as if before living gods, but behind the magnificence was a code as cold as steel. Immortals were forbidden to show fear or pity. They could not laugh before the king or weep at the sight of death. Their faces were trained to stillness, their eyes to silence. Every gesture carried the weight of ritual. Every command was sacred. Their meals were served from golden dishes, yet they ate in complete quiet. They were luxury made discipline, splendor forged into obedience. At the top of this hierarchy stood the 1,000, the king's apple-bearers. Their spears ended in golden pomegranates, symbols of eternity and life. They guarded the royal chambers, slept beside the throne, and accompanied Cyrus into every battle. It was said their loyalty was so absolute that no man among them feared death, only failure. When they rode beside their king, sunlight glinted off their golden spearheads like a storm of fire. Their presence silenced crowds and froze the hearts of enemies. They were not merely soldiers. They were the living manifestation of divine will, the bridge between mortal and God. And as the Immortals stood in endless formation beneath the crimson sky, armor blazing like liquid light, the message was clear. To serve the king was to become deathless, to cease being a man, and become the empire itself. No empire can survive without the art of killing made divine. For the Immortals, every weapon was a prayer, every strike a sacred ritual. They carried a trinity of death: the composite bow, the long spear, and the short sword akinakes, each forged to serve a purpose, each bound by the same law of perfection. Before battle, they stood in absolute silence, their armor glowing like hammered sunlight. When the signal was given, the first movement was not a shout but the whisper of bowstrings. 10,000 arrows hissed through the air, blackening the sky like a living storm. The rain of death fell without mercy, piercing shields, flesh and hope alike. Men screamed, not from pain, but from the realization that the sun itself had disappeared. Then the second act began. As the enemy broke and stumbled, the spear line advanced, a wall of wicker shields and bronze-tipped discipline. Their formation moved as if pulled by a single heartbeat. Each thrust was measured, each step exact. Spears impaled the dying, lifted them, and dropped them as the line rolled forward through dust and blood. And when the distance between life and death closed, the final movement began. The akinakes, short, curved, and cruel, flashed in the heat of battle. The air became thick with breath and blood. The Immortals killed without rage, without sound. They cut throats, split ribs, and moved on, faces calm as priests at worship. It was not a battle. It was a ceremony. Their warfare was more than physical. It was psychological domination. They wanted the enemy to lose before the first arrow flew. Rumors spread that no matter how many Persians died, the line would always remain unbroken. The illusion of eternity crushed morale long before the spears did. Even the Greeks, proud and defiant, whispered of them with awe and dread. "When their arrows blot out the sun," one Spartan said, "we shall fight in the shade." The Immortals did not rely on rage or chaos. They thrived on coordination, on the terrifying beauty of control. They fought as one body, bled as one organism, and when one fell, another filled his place with seamless precision. To their enemies, it was as if they were fighting time itself, unending, unstoppable, immortal. In the rising heat of the battlefield, their armor shimmered gold and red, their movements perfect and inhuman. The sky trembled with fire, the earth drank the blood of kings, and through it all the Immortals marched forward, eternal, methodical, divine. By the middle of the 6th century before Christ, the Immortals had become the embodiment of Persian might, the steel heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Wherever they marched, nations fell and gods seemed to vanish before them. Their first great test came under Cyrus the Great, when Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, defied Persia's rule. In 539 BCE, under a blood-red dawn, the Immortals crossed the dried bed of the Euphrates River, slipping beneath the towering gates as the city slept. By sunrise, Babylon had fallen without a cry. Priests who once worshipped Marduk knelt in silence before Persian soldiers. The Immortals did not plunder, but they occupied, calm, silent, inevitable. The world saw the beginning of a new order. Years later, under Cambyses II, the Immortals marched south into Egypt, the ancient land of gods and death. Their reputation had spread like plague. Egyptian soldiers trembled at their name, and stories whispered of a cruel Persian trick, that they carried sacred cats before their ranks, knowing the Egyptians would not dare strike the animals sacred to their goddess Bastet. Whether true or not, the result was the same. The pharaoh's armies broke before the first arrow flew. Cities surrendered in terror, and the Nile ran red with empire. But their greatest trial came decades later, under Xerxes I, at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. Here, against a handful of Greek warriors led by King Leonidas of Sparta, the Immortals expected an easy slaughter. They marched into the pass confident, their golden ranks shining like a living sun. Yet the narrow cliffs betrayed them. Their famed mobility vanished, their long lines collapsed inward, and their light wicker shields splintered under the crushing force of Greek bronze. The Spartans fought like men possessed, not for conquest, but for defiance. Their long spears pierced through Persian armor. Their laughter echoed across the canyon as Immortals fell. The discipline of Persia met the fury of freedom, and for the first time the deathless bled. When a local traitor revealed a hidden path through the mountains, Xerxes sent the Immortals to flank the Greeks. The maneuver succeeded. The Spartans were surrounded, slaughtered to the last man. Yet the victory was bitter. The pass was won, but the illusion of perfection was broken. The Immortals had conquered nations, toppled kings and silenced gods, yet at Thermopylae, they learned a truth no empire wishes to face: that courage can wound eternity. The whispers of that battle would follow them for centuries. Even in triumph, their legend carried a scar, a shadow across their golden name. For in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Immortals discovered they were mortal after all. A century had passed since Cyrus forged his empire in fire and faith. The Achaemenid world, once endless and untouchable, now trembled beneath the shadow of a new god of war, Alexander of Macedon. In the autumn of 331 BCE, the fate of Persia would be written on a blood-soaked plain called Gaugamela. Dawn came pale and cold. Across the horizon, tens of thousands of Persian soldiers stretched like waves of gold and red beneath a rising sun. At the center stood King Darius III, his chariot plated in silver, horses draped in purple cloth. Beside him, as always, were the Immortals, 10,000 warriors still carrying the pride of Cyrus's golden age. Their faces were calm, but their eyes told the truth. They were marching into the dusk of their empire. The earth began to tremble before the storm of Macedonian cavalry. Alexander's army, smaller, faster, hungrier, moved with terrifying precision. He had studied the Immortals' every tactic, every rhythm of their march, every pattern of their arrows. Now he used their own perfection against them. When the signal sounded, the Immortals unleashed their storm. Arrows darkened the sky, raining death upon the advancing Macedonians. But Alexander's troops broke formation, splitting like water around stone. Then came the counterstrike, cavalry lances flashing in the sunlight, tearing into the Persian lines. Horses screamed, men fell, and the sound of bronze meeting flesh drowned out prayer. Still, the Immortals did not falter. They closed ranks, shields locking, spears thrusting. Each death was replaced by another warrior, just as it had been for centuries. Yet the illusion of eternity was breaking. Macedonian steel cut through the wall like thunder splitting a tree. For the first time in generations, the deathless bled, and bled deeply. Amid the chaos, Darius turned to flee. His horses reared, the silver chariot spinning through dust and fear. Around him, his royal guard, the apple-bearers, fought to the death to buy their king's escape. They fell one by one, encircled by Alexander's men, their golden pomegranate spears glinting in the firelight. The empire's divine shield had shattered. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was silent. The Immortals, once the symbol of unending power, lay scattered across the plain. Yet even in death they were dignified, their formation still half intact, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. Alexander the Great, walking among the fallen, stopped before the bodies of the Immortals. He did not mock them. Instead, he ordered his men to show them respect. Their courage, their order, their unbreakable spirit. He recognized greatness even in ruin. In time, Alexander would adopt Persian customs, wearing their robes and keeping a guard of Persian soldiers at his side, the legacy of the Immortals reborn in the army of their conqueror. Gaugamela was not just the end of an empire. It was the death of eternity itself, and the beginning of a new one born from its ashes. When the dust of Gaugamela finally settled, and the fires of Persia dimmed, the Immortals did not vanish, they simply stepped into legend. Their empire crumbled, their king was gone, and their golden armor lay scattered across the plains. Yet something deeper survived, something that even time could not conquer. Across centuries their spirit echoed through the armies that came after. The Roman Praetorians, the Byzantine Varangian Guard, The elite janissaries of the Ottoman court, all were built upon the same idea first born in the Persian desert, a permanent, professional corps of soldiers bound not by blood, but by devotion. The Immortals had shown the world that war could be engineered, that loyalty could be manufactured, that discipline itself could become a weapon. They were the first to understand that a soldier's strength was not just in muscle, but in unity, in the invisible thread of order tying 10,000 souls into one will. They mastered the symphony of warfare long before modern generals could name it, archers softening the enemy, cavalry slicing flanks, infantry pressing forward in perfect rhythm. Every motion was designed, every death replaced, every fear erased. Centuries later, philosophers would call this military doctrine. To the Persians, it had simply been faith. Even their name carries mystery. Some scholars whisper that Herodotus, the Greek chronicler, may have erred, that the word anousia meant companions, not immortals. But whether mistranslation or divine accident, the truth remains. They became immortal in every sense that mattered, because immortality is not to live forever. It is to never be forgotten. Myth tried to distort them. In later centuries, artists and storytellers turned them into monsters, faceless demons, cruel servants of tyranny. But the truth is far more unsettling. The Immortals were not beasts. They were thinkers, architects of terror, craftsmen of control. They fought with intellect as sharp as their blades. They understood human fear, how to break it, how to weaponize it. When they marched, they carried not just spears and shields, but the psychology of dominance. They were not gods, but they served their empire like one. Not slaves, but instruments of divine order. To look into the eyes of an immortal was to see not hatred, but purpose. The terrifying calm of a man who no longer belonged to himself. Even now, echoes of their discipline ripple through time. In every elite soldier who moves without hesitation, in every army that drills for perfection, in every commander who values control over chaos, the shadow of the Immortals still stands. The empire that birthed them is dust, its kings long forgotten. Yet the lesson remains carved into the bones of history, that true immortality is not found in blood or conquest, but in legacy. And so when the world's armies march in perfect rhythm beneath banners of power, when their boots strike the earth in unison, listen closely. You may still hear them. The Immortals have never stopped marching.